Climate change is a truly global environmental problem. It doesn't matter where the emissions from greenhouse gases are coming from, but it is impacting all of us on the globe. So that means that we all hang together. And we hang together because the climate change, as we observe it today, is human induced. It started all with the Industrial Revolution in 1750, when human energy was complemented with fossil fuels that we were digging out from the underground. So we started with coal, later we used oil, we use gas. And so these fossil fuels are causing today the greenhouse gas problem, the climate change as we observe it. Now, the problem is that these greenhouse gas emissions come from all over the world. Originally, they came primarily from the Western countries who knew their industrialization. Today, they come, as of the 1990s, increasingly from the emerging economies, and not least the emerging economies from Asia. And so you see on the graph how much we are in a devastating situation today. The emissions from greenhouse gas emissions just go up. The emissions from the Western traditional emitters leveled off in the 1950s and 60s, but in the 1980s and 90s, and as of the year 2000, the newly emerging economies added a massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And on the next slide, you see that we are really condemned to work together. And we do that in the United Nations under the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement requested from all parties to make pledges, policy promises, if you like it. And there is good news and bad news, as you see on the slide. That is that the good news is that the pledges prevented climate change to happen by the end of the century up to 5 degrees Celsius. Today, we reckon that those policy pledges bring us to 3 degrees Celsius. So far, the good news. The bad news is that scientists have been telling us that we have to reduce the overall climate change to a range between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius. So we still have to shave off another 1 degree Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. And so we have been tying up our pledges. And as we move to the COP26, which is the new and upcoming round of climate negotiations in November of this year in the UK, the European Union has been launching a debate about how to tighten up the pledges that were made under the Paris Agreement. And so in 2019, the Europeans decided to make their continent climate neutral. And that was provoking quite some interest. And the year after, in September of 2020, the Chinese president Xi Jinping declared that by 2060, China would become carbon neutral. And that was a very positive surprise to all of us, because China is a major emitter, is emitting roughly 1/3 of overall emissions in the world. And the fact that China was moving was so important. Now, the last change we had is that the United States was returning to the club, which is extremely important. And President Biden reversed the decision of President Trump, not only to join again the Paris Agreement, because they were the exception in the world having left the Paris Agreement, but on top of that, to decide that also the United States would become net zero, as they call it, by 2050. And so we have a drive towards carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. Since then, important countries such as Japan or South Africa and others have been joining the club. So this brings us to the question, what is the vision of the European Union related to climate change? Well, the policy has been de facto translated into the following. Today, the climate change that we are experiencing already is in fact caused by us, by the Western countries having gone first through their industrialization. But in the future, our children and grandchildren are going to undergo the climate change that is primarily coming from the newly emerging economies. So the Paris Agreement was so important and so strategically important to bring everybody together on the same page. And as we all are now moving together, the Europeans have thought that they have to move first for several reasons. One of the reasons is that, of course, the Europeans have a major responsibility. The Industrial Revolution started in Europe, in the UK, and then in Belgium, Germany, France, etc. So we have a special responsibility when it comes to climate change. But there is perhaps also an economic opportunity, because the ones who go into low carbon technology first, they may reap the benefits of that. So in fact, the Green Deal, as Commission President von der Leyen has been announcing when she started her period in office in 2019, was that the Green Deal would make Europe in a kind of laboratory for low carbon technology and for low carbon policies. And so that's a very important realization. Now, in fact, the Europeans started already since the 1990s with the beginnings of their climate policy that really took shape as of 2005. You could say that the Europeans have 2 decades of environmental policy. And what the Europeans have been realizing is a decoupling between economic growth and the emissions of greenhouse gases related to that economic growth. Because there is a kind of a stubborn myth, as if economic prosperity is always linked with high emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the Europeans have been showing that that is not the case. That since 1990, the base year of the United Nations, emissions have been going down, while the GDP, the growth, the economic growth, has been going up. And today we are more or less emitting 24% less compared to 1990. And we are determined to do better. So Ursula von der Leyen and the new Commission has been followed by the entire amount of European institutions that declared and supported the Green Deal, that we would not only go for climate neutrality by 2050, but by 2030, we would reduce our emissions with 55% at least compared to 1990 levels. And so there is a determination to continue that delinking, that separation from increased economic growth and the declining trend in the greenhouse gas emissions. And so the Europeans developed a Green Deal strategy as an encompassing economic strategy. It is, of course, about the energy sector, because the energy sector is consuming most of the fossil fuels. But the energy sector is linked very closely with the transport sector and with the industrial sector and with the way we construct buildings. So it is an encompassing strategy that is covering many more sectors than just the sector of energy. And so that encompassing economic strategy is based on one basic pillar, that is to bring forward low carbon innovations and bring forward an economic strategy in which we invest in these low carbon innovations. And so the Green Deal is in fact a comprehensive investment strategy, where we also need not only the public sector, but also the private sector. And one of the most remarkable things we observe today is that the sector of private finance, our banks and institutional investors, are moving towards sustainable finance. They are disclosing increasingly their information about the climate risks they are incurring. There is a taxonomy that is being developed as we speak, And what is a taxonomy? It is defining what is a green investment. We all know renewables is really green, but many other activities like producing steel or cement or chemicals, is that a green activity or not? And the truth is that some of these activities are really green, while many others are not green whatsoever. Now, I underlined that this Green Deal strategy is needing a lot of investment. And as you can see on the slide, the European Commission made some estimates about how much investment is required. And in particular, in the field of energy, more investments are going to be necessary. There are a tremendous amount of investments already planned, but on top of that, the Green Deal is going to require 350 billion every year of additional investment between 2021 and 2030. So the Green Deal is a huge investment program, in particular in the energy sector. Energy/transport, you may say. But in industry, that is where still very important nuts need to be cracked, because we are consuming a lot of commodities like steel and cement, chemicals, that are in their production very carbon intensive. And so the Green Deal is paying a lot of attention to low carbon innovation. And this low carbon innovation is all about producing low carbon cement, low carbon steel, low carbon chemicals. And one of the new energy carriers that is receiving a lot of attention there is, of course, hydrogen and new technologies like carbon capture and storage. And that, together with the massive investments in the field of energy, not least renewables and the digital and the grid that is required to make it happen, and the storage facilities, make that a huge investment program is needed. Now, today, we are, of course, still in the middle of the COVID crisis. And the period following the COVID crisis is going to be characterized by economic trouble. We know that. And so the Europeans have been taking, at the end of 2020, quite a number of important decisions, critical decisions, related to the spending of their budget. And so the post-COVID recovery fund, the Next Generation EU, as it is named, is a new fund of 750 billion euros that comes in addition to the fund of the Europeans that is 1 trillion and 100 billion size. That is significant. That means that 1,800 billion euros together is available for relaunching the economy. And now comes the very important element of the Green Deal, is that roughly a third of this huge sum of money of 1,800 billion is going to be spent in direct relationship to the climate neutral goal that was set for 2050 and the 55% target for 2030. So that's quite a significant budgetary impact that should fuel the new interest of sustainable finance that comes from the private sector. Now let's turn a moment to the policy measures that are necessary, because we all agree we will have to invest tremendously in low carbon solutions. We will require a lot of new innovations, not least in the energy sector, that are already underway: renewables, the grid, the digital, the storage facilities. But we need also policies to drive all these changes into the market, because the market itself may find this technological solution sometimes too expensive. And so the EU has developed a raft of policy measures, specific ones and more general ones. And the specific ones related to climate change are related to the energy sector in particular, the point of attention of this course. And one of the most central elements is the emissions trading system. And what is the emissions trading system? That is, it follows up on the advice of economists to put a price on carbon. And that price on carbon is put by restricting the total amount of pollution that is allowed. And so the ETS, as you will go into that, or you have already gone into the emissions trading system as a particular instrument that is putting a price on carbon. Now, important is that today, this price on carbon is historically very high. It's today around 40 plus euros per ton of carbon dioxide, and this price is expected to continue rising. So the ETS, putting a price on carbon, because what is cheap or what has no price, has no limit, people do not pay attention to it, is an absolutely essential piece. But it is combined with other specific legislation. On renewables, for example, we have been setting targets in Europe on how to double the amount of renewables pre-2010 from less than 10% to a target of 20% by 2020. And it is, as part of the Green Deal, expected that we will double that amount again by 2030. So renewables and specific policies to drive renewables into the market, and in particular, wind and solar, of which the cost has gone down significantly, is a very important element of the equation. Of course, policies to improve energy efficiency, insulating houses, the construction sector, having transport systems that are cheaper, energy efficient cars. And so cars, for example, is also an issue on which the Europeans have been regulating quite significantly. And through that regulation, and that's CO2 regulation for cars, the electric vehicle is now on its way. All major car manufacturers are preparing for putting on the market by 2025 at least a quarter, if not much higher, share of their sales will be electric by then. So energy, transport is a major piece of investment that will be envisaged through specific instruments. One of them is, for example, the heating of houses and office blocks, where heat pumps are going to be used. Now, in heat pumps, there are specific gases, the fluorinated gases, and also there we have been looking at and we have been restricting the use and the characteristics of the fluorinated gases. So a raft of policy measures that have been developed, including targets for the member states, and they are combined, making the policy that has been able to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions of Europe quite significantly. So to conclude, what is the summary of the experience that Europeans had after, say, some 20 years of climate policy? And I would like to summarize them in 5 points. The first is that it is absolutely important to put all the noses of all stakeholders in the same direction, public and private sector. In the public sector, we have the Paris Agreement. So globally, we have been able to put the noses in the right direction. And thank God we have the United States back inside the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely important. So the Paris Agreement at the European level, the heads of state, the European Parliament has been very helpful in putting the noses of the 27 member states in the same direction. And also at the national level, many states have a federal structure. Also that structure and the local level, the cities and the regions need to be put into the same direction. So putting the noses in the same direction is of absolute importance. If one level works against the other, then you are not getting there. The second point I would like to underline is that our experience is that policies have been put in place in a gradual manner. Gradual, the development of the ETS went gradual from 2005 with a rather loose cap, with with a tightening of the cap over time. On renewables, we were first going for 20% by 2020, and then we are now going for much higher percentages. So the gradual nature of our policy intervention has been very important. You need support from the public at large, and you have to start low and tighten up en cours de route. And so that gradual development of climate policy explains why Europe has been able already now to bring down its greenhouse gas emissions with 24% compared to 1990, and is on its way to do much more. And that is not only to be due to the COVID crisis, that's going to be a temporary dip. What is much more important is the structural tendential decline of greenhouse gas emissions. The third element is that everybody needs to be involved. And let's not kid ourselves. Some policy measures are not good news for everybody. If I take one example, one of the worst fossil fuels is hard coal. And that means that we have to leave coal behind. We have to stop coal mining activity. And coal mining activity has been stopped already in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, in the UK, in Spain, and in Germany to a large extent. But it will have to go further. And that is not so good news for coal mining regions that still are very important, not only in Germany, but also in Poland, in Romania, and Bulgaria, and some other member states. So coal mining activity and coal mining regions need support. And that is why the European Commission has been creating a just transition fund in order to bring those who are likely to lose out in the climate transition and the energy transition, to help them restructure their economic activities. The fourth element I would like to underline as an economist is that putting a price on carbon is absolutely important. Something that is for free is not receiving any attention by the economic operators. And so putting a price on carbon, like we are doing under the ETS, like others are doing through a carbon tax, is absolutely important. And this pricing of carbon is getting steam across the world. Since January of 2021, the Chinese have been rolling out a nationwide cap and trade system like we have the ETS in Europe, and that is good news for the world at large. And the fifth element is that, of course, the heart of the entire strategy, as I have been underlining under the Green Deal, is innovation, low carbon innovation, and investments in this low carbon potential, not just in industry, but also in infrastructure. For example, I mentioned in passing hydrogen. Now, hydrogen will require a new infrastructure, and that's going to be quite demanding to pipe around the hydrogen where it is needed in industrial centers, etc. So investing in innovation and investing in low carbon potential is absolutely important. So I would like to conclude my talk to that. For those who would like to dig further in the issue, there is a book that I did together with my colleague Peter Vis over the last 2 decades of climate policy in the EU. And that book is for free downloadable under the open source today as we speak, and the reference is indicated on the slide. Thank you for your attention.